This coffin is being prepared for a man who will shortly be executed for the crime of speaking his own mind. It's all happened before. The same story has been repeated many times, and it's clear how things will turn out. Most political prisoners vanish with their own execution, but a few men survive the obscurity which their executioners wish upon them. They are remembered long after the men who killed them have been forgotten. One of these victims was the Greek philosopher Socrates. Throughout his long life, he argued with the young men of 5th century Athens, questioning all their beliefs and teaching them to take nothing on trust. He produced all round him a mood of skepticism and argument, which finally brought him into conflict with the authorities of the Greek city-state. He was indicted by a tribunal of his fellow citizens, brought to trial and condemned to death. In the year 399, 400 years before the crucifixion of Christ, he was thrown into jail, and after a short period of amnesty, during which he consistently turned down all offers of escape, he was given poison and died without pain in the presence of his closest friends.
Why have you arrived so early?
Well...
What time is it?
It's almost dawn.
I wonder the warder let you in.
I've been coming here so often, he's used to me by now. Besides, there are ways of persuading him.
How long have you been there?
Quite a time.
Well, why didn't you wake me up? Sitting there in silence like that.
I wonder you can sleep so peacefully. You seem to take everything so calmly. I haven't slept like that for months.
It'd be strange, wouldn't it, Crito? If a man of my age were to complain about dying.
Age doesn't make any difference.
All right. But why have you come so early?
It's bad news, I'm afraid.
Ah, yes. The amnesty's over, isn't it?
Yes. As far as I can see, it's to be today when...
Well, if that's the way it has to be. I don't think it'll be today.
What makes you think that?
Well, you see, just now I was dreaming.
What about?
there was this beautiful woman dressed in white. She said to me...
Oh, look, Socrates, why don't you take my advice and try and escape? People who don't know us will start saying that we let you down. Couldn't spare the cash, they'll say. We're too mean to pay for a friend's escape. That's what people will say. They won't believe us when we say that we urged you to go, and that it was you who let us down.
My dear Crito, what does it matter what people say? Majority opinion, indeed.
But you've got to pay some attention to the majority. After all, they're the ones that do the greatest harm.
I only wish that was true. Because if they could surely do the greatest good as well. But the majority can't really do anything. Whatever they do more or less by chance.
All right, all right. Now, I know you're worried that if you escape, we'll be tried and have to pay huge fines. Now, if that's what's worrying you, please forget it. We have the right to take that risk, and worse, to try and save you. Can't you see we have that right as friends? Please do what I say. There are plenty of all, only too willing to help you to try and escape, and it won't need much money. I can give you enough to see you through. And if you're worried about me, there's always Simmlas and Cebes, so don't hesitate on our account. Oh, look, Socrates, you're being so wrong-headed about this. You could escape perfectly well, but you seem to be falling in with your enemy's plans. You're betraying your own children. You should be bringing them up and educating them. Instead of that, you seem prepared to die and leave them to chance. You shouldn't have children in the first place if you're not ready to finish their education. You're taking the easy way out. And you're making us look like cowards, too. Oh, everything's gone wrong from the start. You needn't have gone into court in the first place. You wouldn't save yourself, and now you're not allowing us to save you. Can't you see it's disgraceful, Socrates? Please come to a decision. Everything's got to be done before tonight.
My dear Crito, you know perfectly well I can't take your advice unless it's really sound. I mean, that's right, isn't it? It's the way I've always been, the way I've always behaved. You can't expect me to change my ways now just because of this little upset. The only thing to decide is what's right and what's wrong. All your remarks about money and educating my children and what people will say, quite irrelevant. The thing to decide is it right to give money to the people who will arrange my escape? And look, we mustn't let the possibility of death or anything else cloud this basic issue of right and wrong.
All right, all right. So what do you want us to do?
Well, we must consider the matter together, mustn't we? The first thing to ask is, ought one to do wrong in any circumstances? Eh?
No, I suppose not.
Oh, come on. We've spent far too long discussing this sort of thing. We both know perfectly well what the answer is, don't we?
Well?
It is quite clear that we must not do wrong even when we have been injured ourselves.
Yes, of course.
No matter what the provocation, it is wrong to retaliate, surely.
Yes, all right.
All right. Now, the second point is this. Ought we to fulfill our obligations, or is it right to wriggle out of them?
Of course you must fulfill them.
Very well, then. If I leave this prison against the will of the state, surely I'm doing it an injury. I'm breaking my obligations. It's as simple as that.
I don't know. I don't know.
Look, just imagine for a minute that I'm running away. And at this moment, the law of the land enters. Stop! Where do you think you're going, Socrates? Are you trying to undermine the Constitution? How can the state continue to survive when private individuals flout the verdicts of the courts? Well, what am I to say to that, Crito?
You'd have to say the verdict was wrong.
Ah, yes. But suppose the law replied, were there escape clauses in our agreement? Didn't you undertake to abide by my decisions? I gave you life. Are you trying to destroy me? Wasn't it through me that your father married your mother? What complaints are you making against the marriage laws? And what about the regulations under which you were brought up and educated? Can you complain about them? No, I would have to reply. And so the law would go on. You were born and brought up and educated under the protection of my regulations. You are a member of my household. You and your father and your mother. And if this is so, you are not on an equal footing with me. You cannot do to me what I can do to you. You didn't expect to be allowed to strike your father in retaliation when he beat you. Can you claim that because we intend to destroy you, you can destroy us? Are you so wise, Mr. Moral Philosopher, that you've forgotten your country is more precious than your father and your mother? Your country is precious and holy. You must revere her and obey her and coax her when she's angry, just as you would your father. And if you can't persuade her, you must obey. You must do what she tells you and never complain. Prison, flogging, war wounds, or death in action. You would never retreat or surrender in the face of the enemy in wartime. And you can't do the same to the courts either. That is what the law of the land would say, Crito. Is it right or wrong?
It's right, I suppose.
But there's something else, too. In addition to bringing me into the world, educating me and giving me all the other benefits of citizenship, the law also gave me the chance of leaving and going somewhere else if I were not satisfied with the way things were. But having stayed, I've made an implicit agreement of total obedience. So that to get up and leave now would constitute a breach of contract.
Well, of course.
Anyway, where could I go? Wherever I went, people would laugh when I told them how I got out of prison dressed up in a disguise. Perhaps I could go somewhere where no one would mind, where law and order were held in contempt, where no one would make the slightest comment about an old man who held on to dear life no matter what. But honestly, where would all our discussions about justice and morality be then? You see, I can't think of life and family first. I must think of justice before everything. At least I shall die as an innocent victim, whereas if I ran away, I'd simply be returning wrong for wrong. And as long as I lived, I'd have to know that I'd betrayed my country, my friends, and all the laws which I believed in. You see, Crito, the voice of the law rings in my ears like music in the ears of an ecstatic. And whatever you say can hardly be heard against its sublime din. It's so loud, I can't hear anything else.
Socrates, I've nothing to say.
Then give it up, Crito. Follow me, and let's do as God says.
I was there the day that Socrates was executed. There'd been a long gap between the sentence and the execution. On the last morning, we came at our usual time, but we were told to wait outside. There were quite a lot of us there, friends mostly. Simmlas was there, and Cebes, Apollodorus, Critobulus, and Socrates' wife, too, with 2 of their children. No, they came later. We'd been to visit him every day during the amnesty, and that morning we were let in just as they were taking the chains off Socrates' legs.
What a strange thing pain is. Surprisingly close to pleasure, isn't it? Like 2 bodies with 1 head. I can't help thinking what Aesop would have made of it. He'd have probably invented a story about pleasure and pain always quarreling, and God trying to stop them by putting them both onto the same body, so that wherever one goes, the other would have to follow.
Well, that reminds me, you're talking about Aesop. I mean, you know, Venus, he was telling me about your writing some poems based on Aesop's fables.
Ah, yes. I've often dreamt I was being told to write verse. So after the death sentence, I decided to turn my hand to it. I took some Aesop fables and turned them into poetry. Yes, the thought of execution concentrates the mind wonderfully. You can tell a Venus that. The threat of death is the one thing to get you writing.
You're not advising him to commit suicide, are you?
I don't know why not. Socrates has always said that philosophers are in love with death.
Oh, yes. But that doesn't mean we have any right to take our own leave of life.
All right, then. Why not?
Well, I suppose it is rather strange, isn't it? After all I've said about death, how attractive it is.
That's what I mean. It's very odd.
Yes, well, it's quite simple, really. There's a mystical doctrine which says that we human beings are here in life on a sort of guard duty. And that while we're here, we're in God's charge. His possessions, almost.
How do you mean? Like cattle or something?
Well, yes, we like to look at it like that. Just like cattle. And like cattle, we must wait to be slaughtered, just as I am waiting now.
But just a moment. You're saying that God's our keeper, right?
Right.
That our life means serving him, right? Now, we all agree that God is the best possible master that a man could imagine. Well, if God's the best master, who could possibly wish to leave his service? So you see, it doesn't just rule out suicide. On your argument, only a fool should enjoy dying, by any means.
Very good, Cebes.
Yes, Socrates, but Cebes has got a point, surely. Your argument against suicide applies to any form of death. If you really believe that we're here in the charge of the best and the most benevolent of all possible owners, it would be mad to wish to leave this life by your hand or anyone else's for that matter.
All right. I see I'll have to defend my position. What are you fussing about? Crito.
He's only him. He says you must try and talk as little as possible. Apparently, talking makes you heated, and evidently that will interfere with the action of the poison. He says you may have to take a second and even a third dose if you get overexcited.
All right, you'd better tell him to prepare 2 extra doses then.
Yes, I had a feeling you'd say that.
All right, then. So I must explain why I think it's reasonable for anyone who's spent his life doing philosophy to be glad to die. Well, you see, philosophy is really a kind of a preparation for death. And if your life's work is a preparation for death, it would be rather odd to worry when the very thing that you've been preparing for finally comes along.
It's very funny, really. Certainly some of the people I know would agree with you that philosophy was death. And philosophers should get what they're looking for.
Yes, of course. But they are right, Simmlas. But unfortunately, they don't realize in what way philosophy is death. Now look, would you agree that death is the separation of the body and the soul?
Yes, of course.
Very well then. You agree that it isn't right for philosophers to concern themselves with physical pleasures, with food, drink, and so on?
The philosopher should despise them.
Ah, yes. But most people would think that anyone who didn't care for physical pleasures was half dead already.
Well, then some people can't see further than their own noses.
All right. Well, now let's consider the way we acquire knowledge. Now, would you say the body helped or hindered us in this? I mean, referring to, for example, to the way in which our eyes deceive us. Well, our other senses are far less reliable and far less accurate. Isn't it a fact that we only really see reality clearly when our intellect is absolutely free from any distraction of sensory experience?
Of course, of course.
And look at the way disease can interfere with our powers of thought. Just think of the time we waste in merely consuming food. And even when we do find time for philosophy, we're always being distracted by our body in one way or another. Now, how can we hope to get at the truth with all this distraction going on? Once you see this, you must realize that you can only achieve pure knowledge through contemplation, by absolute freedom from the limits of body and sense. It's only after death, when our souls become separated from our bodies, that they can achieve true independence. And the more independent we can make ourselves from our body while we're alive, the nearer we are likely to get to the truth.
Yes. I suppose so.
So you see, it would be quite absurd for a philosopher to be upset when the time came for him to die. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. The whole aim of his life is achieving wisdom. Thousands of people have chosen to die rather than endure the separation from their lovers or their families. And by the same token, a lover of wisdom should be willing to die in order to be with the thing that he loves most. So whenever you see a man complain about dying, you can be sure that he is no lover of wisdom, but that he is in love with his own body, and probably with wealth and power as well.
Yes, certainly the two things go together.
You see, the pursuit of wisdom is really a kind of religious purification. There's an old myth that says that the people who die unsanctified lie in the mud, and those that have been cleansed are the ones who practiced philosophy. I've been one of them. Whether I was right to try or whether I really achieved anything, I shan't really know until I get there. Quite soon, in fact.
All right, that's fine, but all this about the soul, it's just not convincing. Not to ordinary people, I mean. Look, perhaps when it leaves the body, the soul, I mean, perhaps it just ceases to exist altogether. So when a man dies, as soon as the soul leaves the body, it just spreads out like breath or smoke, and then poof, nothing, anywhere. I mean, I grant you that if he did stay in one piece, free from all the snags you were talking about, well, it would be all right. But the idea of a dead man's soul still able to think, that takes a lot of proving.
All right, Cebes. Isn't it true that everything becomes what it is from once having been its opposite?
I don't understand.
Well, look, when something becomes bigger, it must once have been smaller, mustn't it? And if something becomes better, it must once have been worse.
Ah, yes, of course, I see what you mean.
All right. Well, now, isn't there an opposite to living, too? In the same way that sleeping is the opposite of waking?
Well, yes, of course. Death.
Quite so. Well, if sleep is the opposite of waking, and waking comes from sleeping, then dying must come from living, and vice versa, of course. The cycle is endless. If the cycle of waking and sleeping were to stop, soon everything would be asleep. And if the cycle of living and dying came to an end, soon everyone would be dead.
Yes, that sounds good sense.
Well, yes, I think so. I don't think we've cheated ourselves. If coming to life is a fact, so also is the rebirth of the living from the dead. And so, therefore, is the existence of the souls of the dead.
Yes, of course. And that tallies with your theory about the process of learning being a sort of recollection. If learning is recollection, when did we learn what we now recollect? It must have been, presumably, on a former occasion. When could that be except before birth? Therefore, the soul is immortal.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute, I don't quite get that.
Well, look. Supposing you set somebody a geometry problem, one that they've never seen before in their life, and they get the answer right. Well, where did they get it from? They must have learnt it somewhere. They must have learnt it in a previous life. Look, supposing you're in love with someone and you see, say, a musical instrument that the person you love plays. Well, that reminds you of the person. Or, say, if you see Simmlas there, that could remind you of me, Cebes. Agreed? Well, this experience of being reminded can only happen with things that we've known at some time. You've seen the person playing, or you've seen Simmlas with Cebes. Well, this can happen with other sorts of things, too. Look, for instance, we all have an idea of equality, absolute equality. Not just two sticks appearing to be equal at one time, because two sticks can appear to be equal at one time and then under different circumstances appear to be quite different, say if one was underwater. Nevertheless, we do have an idea of what it would be like for the sticks to be absolutely equal. We have a standard against which we can judge their approximate equality. Well, where do we get it from? This standard, I mean. Surely not from the sticks, because we've already said that they can only be approximately equal. The point is that ordinary experience can only be approximate. Nevertheless, when we do see two sticks that are approximately equal, it puts us in mind of this notion of absolute equality. Surely that's the same sort of experience as being reminded of a lover when you see his mandolin.
Yes, it must have been acquired before birth.
Yes, and lost again at birth, what's more. It's only later by seeing two approximately equal sticks that we're reminded of this prenatal experience of absolute equality. So you see, the soul's existence before birth is proved.
All right. Well, I accept the question of the soul before birth, but as for existing after death, I'm still not convinced about that. I mean, the soul could still be destroyed as soon as it leaves the body, couldn't it?
Yes, but all you've got to do is simply combine that argument with the one about living things coming from the dead. But I can still see that you're frightened that when the soul comes out of the body, it'll simply get blown away.
Yes, yes.
All right, then. Let's look at it like this for a moment. What sort of things would you expect to break up and disintegrate? Well, surely the things which are variable and made up of different parts. These are the things that are more likely to fall to bits, aren't they? Whereas simple, invariable things would be quite safe.
Well, what about an example?
All right, then. Think of the things you perceive through your senses, like men, or horses, or clothes. Now, these are objects made up of many contradictory qualities. But the things we've just been discussing, like absolute equality, justice, and goodness, and so on, are simple, uncompounded, and invariable. Well, I mean, we've already agreed, haven't we, that the world of the sense is the world of the variable. And it's just where the soul gets bogged down and becomes dizzy with its contact from the inconstancy of ordinary things. But if it can enjoy the state of pure contemplation, the soul can stop wandering about and stay in contact with eternal simplicity. This is what we call wisdom. Well, the soul is also in this class of simple, invariable objects. It is indissoluble and immortal. We've already proved that. And it can only be known through a process of intuition. Whereas the body is complex, variable, mortal, and is known only through a process of ordinary sensory perception. Look, when you die, the mortal part of you, the corpse, decays, falls to bits. But it doesn't happen all at once. It can last for quite a while. Depends on what sort of condition you were in when you died, and, for example, the time of year. And if you dry it and embalm it, like the Egyptians, it'll last a great deal longer. And even then, things like the bones and the ligaments last, well, almost forever. Now, is it really likely that something as noble as the human soul would just get puffed away from all this pathetic wreckage? Surely it must go straight to God.
Yes. At least the soul that has been purified by philosophy will.
Yes. You see, I imagine that if you care too much for your body and only feel the reality of physical things, your soul will become coarse, weighed down with impurities, and sink back again, back into the visible world. That's what ghosts are. Simply coarsened souls lurking in graveyards that can't drag themselves away from their material remains. It's only by doing philosophy that you begin to realize that your soul is really bound up inside your body, glued to it almost, and forced to see everything through the prison bars of the flesh. And one wallows in the mud of one's own ignorance. And you begin to realize that through bodily desire, one actually becomes an accomplice in one's own captivity. Each pleasure and pain is like a nail that fastens the soul to the body more and more. And as it goes on, the more infected the soul becomes. So it becomes harder and harder for it to experience the clear sight. Without philosophy, the soul has no chance. No chance at all.
Look, I can see very well what you're driving at, but there's still something that doesn't quite fit. All that you're saying about the body and the soul could apply to a musical instrument. Look at a musical instrument. Its strings and so on are just like the body, completely physical, mortal. Whereas its melody is rather like the soul. It's completely invisible, immaterial. When a musical instrument begins to fall to bits and the strings go slack, you can't get a melody out of it anymore. Well, isn't that just the same with the body and the soul? I mean, the body is just like a musical instrument, and when its strings go slack through disease or old age, surely the body's melody, which is the soul, is the first thing to go.
Well, it looks as though Simmlas has got a point there. What has Cebes to say about it?
Well, I don't agree with Simmlas. I think that the soul is much stronger than the body and can surely outlast its decay. But I'm still worried, because even if we go along with your theory, Socrates, that the soul can be reborn again many times, there's still the possibility that it may eventually wear out after several cycles of death and rebirth. So you see, there's still no guarantee of absolute immortality. And there's always the fear that when you die, this occasion may be the one when the soul has to die as well.
After all this argument, no one seemed quite confident. Even now, when there were only a few hours left, no idea seemed completely reliable. Perhaps one should never really trust argument on this subject again.
But we have to, Phaedo. Arguments may break down time and time again, but we must always go back and overcome the objection. It's a matter of life and death for me, can't you see that? It's not just you I'm trying to convince of the immortality of the soul. It's myself. What you're saying, Cebes, is that every physical life which the soul leads has a sort of sickness which gradually weakens it until it finally dies. You could call it the fever of life, I suppose. What you're saying is that this time, the soul may die when the body dies.
Exactly.
All right. You see, your argument, Cebes, simply turns the soul into a rather long-lasting piece of bodily tissue, something which gives out after a while. But it isn't that kind of thing at all. The soul is completely different in nature from the body. If death was the end of everything, then the wicked would get the best bargain. But if it is immortal, then the body is just simply a waiting room, which is unwise to get too fond of. Life in the body is rather like living underwater on the seabed. A world of vague shapes and blurred sounds. Everything softened by mud and salt. We only have vague ideas of the clear world above the water, where everything is gleaming with light and color. Here in this world, everything is covered with sediment and slime. The damned souls get caught in a deep underground stream and get pulled down deeper and deeper into a world of rocks and lava. Down, down, into a great burning lake. But the soul that has lived in holiness finds a realm which makes all other places seem like a prison. It's a place where there's nothing physical, where words fail, and you have to be silent. Besides, there's no time left to talk about it, is there? One must take off the body and go dressed in nothing but prudence, patience, temperance, and fortitude. It's all you're allowed. I'm going to take my bath now.
Do you have any last wishes, Socrates? Nothing for us or for your children?
No, nothing special. Look after yourselves.
We'll do our best. How are we to bury you?
Any way you like. I can't convince you, can I? It's not me you'll be burying, it'll be a dead body. And you can do what you like with it. Ah, yes. Well, what do I do? You know about this sort of thing?
You just rig it straight down, sir. And you walk around till you feel your legs are getting heavy.
Huh?
Then lie down on the bed. There's no pain, sir.
I see.
Socrates walked about for a while and then complained that his legs were feeling heavy. He lay down on his bed as the man recommended. After a while the warder pinched his foot and asked him if he felt it, and Socrates said no. Then he did the same with his legs, and when the numbness reached his waist, Socrates said, "I'm out of danger now, the fever's gone. Say a prayer of thanks for me, will you?" Then Crito asked him if there was anything else, but Socrates made no reply to this question. And soon his gaze became fixed, and Crito closed his eyes, and that was how he died.